you there for Cantonese? If you could make your announcement, I can't hear you. Maybe I'm not in the right thing. That's good. Okay.
廣東嘅即時口譯服務。如果你想獲得我同同事嘅即時廣東話口譯服務嘅話，陣間啟動咗翻譯功能之後，喺工具列上面選取地球圖示，選取中文或者廣東話嘅項目。如果你只係想聽到廣東話嘅，聽唔到講者用英文嘅語音咧，請你亦都可以選擇關閉原。如果用流動裝置或者安卓系統上網嘅話咧，角落透過3點度單擊進入，亦都可以選擇我哋嘅服務嘅。OK。
Thank you. So everyone should be signed in to Spanish or Chinese, and then we're going to get started. Again, thank you all for Housing and Environmental Justice Workshop presented by Deeply Rooted and talking about Oakland 2045. So I had asked folks if they wanted to put in the team their affiliation if they have one, and their biggest wish for Oakland in 2045. Yes, great wishes. So, and all this is going to get logged. I'm a part of Eastside Arts Alliance and part of the Deeply Rooted team. I'm slower for interpretation. We had a workshop yesterday, but there were a lot of questions at the end and we ran out of time. Hoping if some folks were here yesterday and they have some questions about the presentation around housing or homelessness, they can after I'm finished doing my intro. And then we're going to go to Miss Margaret and Diana Environmental Justice. 20 minutes on that with a lot of good information. We didn't get to do that yet. Margaretta is going to do housing kind of quicker. Needa Bee is going to do homelessness a little quicker, and of time at the end, which, you know, we really want to hear what folks are thinking and what questions for a large group discussion. What is the general plan? It hasn't been updated. Last updated was in the 90s, and it's meant for Oakland planning. So it affects us in every way possible. Transportation, housing, environmental justice, and you know, some things that can affect land policy is on that slide. Next slide. And this is who we are, the Deeply Rooted team. And you can see we hubs throughout Oakland, trying to really reach out to folks whose voices are not in these type of planning processes. So going to the cultural hubs, the cultural infrastructure, reaching people where they're at and engaging them and having more of a back and forth dialogue, enough power to affect change and really make a difference in what happens with this. The next slide is how your engagement matters. And this is, you all and your children and the next generation are going to be the lives that are affected. Citywide vision with community priorities and some of the key and just undo past harms and address inequity. So as we're thinking about think about those goals that we have. And that's all for oh no, I'm sorry, we're doing the Q&A. That's right. So let's see how we can do this. Maybe if we see everyone and folks raise their hand or put in the chat if questions left over from yesterday's presentation. And my Deeply Rooted teammates should help me manage this. No hands raised. Oh, here, oh no, those are the wishes still. Which is great. So I think we can probably get just Miss Margaret's presentation, if folks feel okay with that. we will have a lot of questions afterwards, I guarantee you. Miss Margaret, you are on.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ms. Margaret Gordon. I am the founder and the co-director of the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project. This slide that you see here now, beginning of the principles for the first National People of Color Environment Summit in 1991, where the principles of this were transformed, translated, distributed nationally to I cannot tell you how many people were at this summit. We utilized across the country and across the world on an issue of justice. My organization participates in using justice principles to build relationships about reduce, recycle, relieve, and revive. Next slide, please. There's a slide about how health and the different people are still being impacted by pollution. We are more from pollution from the air, water, or soil issues than from past practices of business in this area. Slide. This is a picture of the could happen to West Oakland if there is a rise. Simultaneously, with the sea level rise, all that have not been updated or cleaned up, the sea level would rush into the groundwater and push up the contaminants. Contaminant soil would be spread all through the neighborhood. So there's in the flatlands that we have doing an assessment and identifying these pieces of land that will burden us in case of sea level rise. Next slide. The flatlands have problems because we are so inundated with traffic doors, West Oakland, downtown, Chinatown, and East Oakland. You know, accidents, fatalities happen every day. And it's having more street lights, crosswalks, bumps, and other things that slow down measures is needed. Simultaneously, not one section at a time. Next slide. Here are some of the things that have happened in West Oakland for the last 3 years and how participating in the development of AB 617 criteria and critical analysis for mitigation planning. This is a lot to digest in one time, but efforts let's continue on. And my big, when we have a next generation who can carry forth, are going to go over and have been happening over and over for the last years. So how will we be able to keep this type of things going? Because after even 2040, there's going to be something else. And what will the next generation do insert themselves in the process. Next slide. These are the potential new things that should have been happening for the last 50 years within Oakland. And so this is another heavy lift that should be happening, but it has not been happening in just in the flatlands areas. And this just shows us there's a lot of work to be done based on just the topic and the bullets that are on this slide. Next slide. You know, planning for a healthy community on a SB 1000 passed in 2006. But here we are in 2022, just now, getting ourselves organized to just to promote the issues of the goals and the policies and the objectives to our EJ communities. And where we still have lots of analysis, because we have to continuously have the data and the research, and having those people who are more supportive of our vision, of our understanding, how we want to see it, our communities. So having the EJ elements is a good start, but we still have to continue to generate the information, orientation, the data, and the research, and the implementation, how it's going to be implemented by us with government, not government, but with government. Next slide. This is a draft of the environmental justice communities throughout the city of Oakland. And there's also, without a lot of investment from the federal or state government and our allies and organizations like West Oakland Environmental Indicators have been pushing forward to make these changes that have burdened our communities, that now it's another time and place where is that we have to really show how we have to be at the table and set the table for these processes. And that having maps like this also is one of the things in the toolkit, and also as a resource for us to be able to refine things in our community, from the street to the sidewalk to inside your house. Next slide.
And if before Margaretta gets started, if I can just give a little bit more context to this map. So earlier this week, the technical consultant released a report looking at racial equity and environmental justice. And this is one of those maps that they shared. And so this is their initial identification of environmental justice communities. And the EJ element that Ms. Margaret spoke to earlier is going to include policies and goals that work to reduce air pollution, going to prioritize community investments for specific communities in Oakland. And so throughout the next few months, Deeply Rooted, we're going to be speaking with you all to hear what neighborhoods are missing in this map, and what neighborhood issues you're currently experiencing. So if you take a look at the map right now, the areas that have been identified as EJ communities are the areas that are in dark blue with red lines. So you'll notice they're all areas in the flatlands. And the technical consultant looked at 50 different indicators, and they considered things like race, poverty, pollution, impacted populations, and the built environment. but
This is,
data alone doesn't tell the full story.
but this is
Because
their
we need to
data.
hear from
But
folks who live
Diane,
and work in
Diane,
Oakland and are on the ground. And
Diane,
so when Deeply Rooted reviewed a previous version of this map last month, Miss Margaret recommended that they include red line neighborhoods, and they did. But we also noticed that there were EJ communities that weren't included. And so I've circled West Oakland. And if you take a look at the left, the westernmost part of Oakland, where there are residents who live right next door to the ports, in this map, they're currently not identified as an EJ community when they should. And that's why in the next few months, we are going to be taking these maps and speaking with you all to hear what should be included. And this map will be updated to reflect that. Because at the end of the day, this plan needs to be able to undo past harms and create safer and healthier communities.
Diane, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay,
Diana,
Diane, this is, please refer this back to their map. This is not our map.
Yes.
This is not the map
Nope,
from
not our map.
This is not our map from our experts. Please refer to this map as their map.
Yes.
All right, this is not our map.
Yes.
Because this is, like you said, it's not a true picture of what we see day to day in West Oakland. So we're gonna have a fight with the technical staff that this is not a true picture.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. That was great. And it's still a very distressing map. And you're saying it's even going to be more distressing when
yes, because that's not the map. That's not the map that I've been working for in West Oakland that shows block by block data of impacts.
Yeah.
All right. So can I finish I'd like to finish my slides. Is there any more slides? My last slides?
No, that was it.
All right.
Margaretta suggested instead of going right to housing, if folks had maybe 5 minutes for questions directly around the environmental justice presentation. This would be a moment for that. You can raise your hand or just shout out, take yourself off mute.
Hey,
Esther.
everyone. Yeah, hi, Miss Margaret. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Esther Goolsby here, definitely representing the people that live and breathe in these communities. And thank you, Miss Margaret, for highlighting their map versus our maps, because when we ground truth, it's totally different. And even when they just say areas, it's street by street. And if you live on them streets, you know how much difference it is. One of the things, the questions that I always bring up when we talk about, even in reduction of like pollution reduction, or like us bringing in you know, our healthier options and everything, is the difference between when we do community work and then what the city like approves. And when we talk about environmental justice, we know that that's so many different policies and areas that it covers. And even in us, in the AB 617 communities, West Oakland and currently East Oakland, and us doing the work, I always question how much time we give collecting from community versus actually like fighting with the policies and changing those. And that includes the city, the county, the state, and even on a federal level, you know, the requirements or the allotments, like they get to pollute, the only way to really to fix it is like around permitting status. And so I guess I just want to say, really to say all of that, because I know we spent many years trying to change policies, and even environmental justice, even housing, land use, all of this. And, you know, here we are 2022. And I like so appreciate that and that SB 1000 got passed, And now that we're finally working on the general plan, and then we have this whole process with community in it, it's just, that is like always in the back of my mind. How much are we actually going to use from us versus like what gets accepted and passed city council and so on and so on in all the ways. So I just wanted to say that. And hi, everybody. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Esther. That is great. And that's what we're trying to do. You know, like we have to have a collective force at all times. And it's hard to think about 20 years from now when we're trying to figure out things today, yesterday. But thank you for that. I don't want to take a lot of time, but Arthur had his hand up. So I want to go to Arthur, please.
Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing today? I just had a question about the slides. Will everyone get a email with a copy of all the slides?
Diana is, yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Actually, Diana, can you put a link to the slides right now into chat so people wanted to look at the slides, especially as we have our back and forth? They'll have
Yeah, I can
access.
do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And one more thing, the map that the technical staff sent that was presented, that is not a hyperlocal mapping, because the hyperlocal mapping can tell you what is happening from the street, what is happening on your on the sidewalk and inside your home. Indoor air quality does not have policy behind it. And that's where we really need policy from the city itself. Indoor air quality is not a determinant in policy as right now. Even though we have healthy home guidelines, we still are not, the city of Oakland is not using guidelines that we know should be making our communities much healthier.
Thank you, Margaret. And like she said, we're doing this with government, not having government do this.
Right. We have to have, yes, we have to have more than just their technical people, because
Exactly.
what they're saying is not like it's not true. By that map right there, it's not.
I think Esther might have her hand up, but I want to go to just this question in the chat about what it's saying. How do we determine what we wanted to do with this information on environmental justice? Like now folks have this, what's the direction?
The direction is to have the law and policy enacted, not based on some theory of change or some developer coming in want to put up a building, because that's what's right now how it's being done. We need to have, and we also have to put in our toolkit, we might have to sue. We always got to have to sue, because you're gonna have somebody who's gonna be so determined that they're gonna find ways to pencil whoop us through planning, permits, and not having full-fledged enforcement on these things that we're talking about. It's for good for our community.
Thank you. Margaretta, maybe you want to just say a little bit more about how folks can stay plugged into this general planning process. Melody wrote a little bit in there. And then if you want to just segue into the housing segment, that would be great.
Sure. And these are really, good morning, everyone. It's so exciting to be in this conversation with everyone. And after 30 years of being in the struggle, including fighting the city on the outside and being in the city to help advance community priorities, I want to echo what Elena said. We're in this, we are doing the hard work of being the bridge between community and the city, right? So staying engaged in this process is important. And I know it's hard because people have not always had good experiences with the city. So just to name and acknowledge that. We created some structures so that there can be more stronger, more powerful community engagement. Number one, the creation of this equity working group. A number of you all are part of that, and the meetings will be starting soon. And so as members of the equity working group, you're there not just to represent yourself, you're there to represent your communities and your neighborhoods, right? The collaboration of Deeply Rooted, as well as the ongoing community engagement process that the city overall, city planning department overall is creating. So there, on a concrete level, to Liz's question in the chat about the development of the community-based map, that is going to be an ongoing process. So Ms. Margaret, CBE, other folks have looked at the map, identified problem areas, and then what we need to do when we are in the community at different community events, show that map to residents and hear from residents what's missing on that map, right? And especially during the summer, and then we'll be through that process of showcasing that map to community, hearing back from them, then producing a community-based map. And hopefully the city will adopt that map as official city map. And so that's the very concrete opportunity we have through this process of partnering with the city. Elena, should I go into housing?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just really wanted to say, we have to figure out what to do with all our sadness and trauma over just looking at that map. I mean, you know, it's really distressing. So yes, you should go into housing. Thank you, Margaretta.
So I want to just start with thanking Miss Margaret for her and so many people in this room for your decades of work, loving Oakland, loving the people of Oakland, and speaking truth to power. As my mother always told me, a true friend tells you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. So I believe very strongly that all our work to show up and tell the city when they're not doing things right, as well as when they are doing things right, that's us showing up as a true friend to city government and to the Oakland community. I'm going to be talking a bit about Oakland's housing conditions, the causes that created these conditions, and what potential solutions look like. This is a lot of information. And I'm available for any follow-up conversations, as well as I think we're going to be having some separate workshops so that we can spend more time that each topic deserves. So there's a lot that I'm going to try to cover in the next 10 minutes. So first, what is this thing called the housing element? Well, it's a state requirement for all local jurisdictions in California to create plans every 7 to 8 years with details on how that jurisdiction will meet specific housing goals set by the state. The City of Oakland Planning Leadership and Deeply Rooted Collaborative, we see this as an opportunity for us to hear from residents who are traditionally not at the city planning table, to be able to incorporate the big ideas that residents have been working on such as Miss Margaret, Esther, and other folks around healthy development guidelines to make sure that those resident efforts and big ideas will get truly integrated into the city's planning efforts. Under the state requirements, there are very aggressive deadlines for the City of Oakland to produce an extremely bureaucratic document. The last Oakland housing element was over 600 pages. So it can be stressful being part of this process, but it's important for people to know that even when the city submits their housing element to the state to make the state deadline of January 2023, we still get to continue working with the city on housing policies. The Oakland City Council passes housing and other policies all the time. For the last housing element from 2015 to 2022 and 2023, Oakland was required to produce over 14,000 new housing units with specific allocations required at the different affordability levels, starting with very low income, moving up to above moderate income. As you can see here from this table, the city overproduced market rate housing units by over 90%, but severely underproduced lower income housing. This is a map of the location of those new housing units, both market rate and affordable units. Because of the regional and statewide housing crisis, Oakland's new housing production goals for 2023 to 2031 are even more, with an increase of 78% from the last cycle.
Margaretta, you have 5 minutes.
This is a table that was produced from the city's technical consultants. What I would want to say here is that we are recommending that the city modifies this information to include more lower income housing rather than market rate housing units. This is also another table produced by the city's technical consultants. And we disagree with the information about city-owned land. We believe that 100% of city-owned land needs to be used for affordable housing. Market rate housing developers do not need city land or city assistance to produce their units. They're doing fine. In every survey that the city has conducted of residents, people over the years have identified their top 4 housing priorities as number 1, homelessness, number 2, housing unaffordability, 3, racial displacement, and 4, blighted housing conditions. As lived experience and data show, both zip code and race matter in terms of who can afford and not afford to live in Oakland, with extreme disparities between residents of color, especially Black residents, and white residents. This translates into racial disparities and displacement, with Black and Asian American residents hardest hit by displacement, with a 31% decline in the Black population citywide and a 6 to 31% decline in the Asian American population and ethnic enclaves. During the same period, the white population increased citywide. lower income residents in East and West Oakland confront the worst housing conditions. It's important for us to know that these housing problems were created by intentional man-made public policy choices. They are not a natural phenomenon. And this includes Jerry Brown, when he was mayor, his 10K plan to make Oakland safe for San Francisco tech workers. That means that today we can make different public policy choices to ensure that all Oaklanders have stable, affordable, and dignified housing. A major factor for today's displacement is also rooted in banks targeting low-income homeowners of color for predatory loans, which caused the foreclosure of over 11,000 homes concentrated in East and West Oakland. These homes were purchased and flipped by speculators into market rate rental housing because single family homes are not protected by rent control under the state law called Costa-Hawkins.
Margaretta, 2 minutes.
The city of Oakland has been working since 2015 on a number of different housing policies dealing with tenant anti-displacement, preventing displacement of low-income homeowners, increasing funding for affordable housing, and using the power of zoning to address the housing crisis. The city is also today working on a number of new housing policies, including the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which would require landlords selling property to provide tenants with first right of purchase. As part of this process, we get to hear from you, from residents, about your big ideas for what the city should be doing to address today's housing crisis. And with that, I will tag another major friend of Oakland, Needa Bee from the Village.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I was having some technical problems yesterday, but am I cool today?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, awesome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out early this Saturday and being part of this process. I'll be talking about just an overview of what's happening with the homeless state of emergency in Oakland, some of the city interventions, and then what we actually do need. Can I get the first slide, please? So I want to ground this conversation for folks to understand that the United States was created, literally was created by creating homeless people. The very first unhoused folks, yes, I'll slow down. The very first unhoused folks here in the United States were the Native Americans. That this country would not have been formed had the Native Americans had their homes stolen and had they not been displaced. And that this system of placing value and over hoarding resources and putting value over hoarding profits just continued with slavery, where Black folks, stolen Africans, were not allowed to own anything. And it continued with the Jim Crow laws and the Black codes, and just continued throughout this whole history of this country up until what Margaretta just laid out with predatory loans, the redlining, predatory foreclosures, and now here we are in gentrification. It's like a form of recolonization. So can I get the next slide? Until we actually address that paradigm that we're in, of being a country based on land theft and homelessness, that we're not going to be able to ever really truly address a housing crisis or a homeless crisis. So there's a few things around homelessness that are based on stereotypes, right? One of the two major stereotypes around homelessness is that everyone who is unhoused has mental health issues, or everyone that's unhoused is a drug addict. And those stereotypes actually came from actual policies that were created in the 80s by the Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan has really set the tone for where we are today. The first stereotype came from when he shut down all public health mental health facilities. There was a time in this country where we had a very robust public mental health program and services that included housing people with mental health that could not take care of themselves. And he shut those all down. And what was the result? Everyone ended up in the streets. And then he also defunded all the outreach programs to any war veterans. And so there was a total disconnect from people coming home, not just from the Vietnam War, but the Korean War and ongoing till today, where there are no outreach services for those folks. So the programs exist, but the outreach to get people to the program no longer exists since the 80s. And then we all know about the war on drugs, AKA the war on Black and brown folks organizing for themselves, fighting for justice and self-determination. And that war on drugs actually ended up breaking up families, breaking up homes, and actually led into homelessness. One thing that people don't realize is that since the 80s, since the crack epidemic hit, Oakland has been leading the country with the highest numbers of homeless youth. And that has been happening since the 80s, and it continues today. And then as Margaretta pointed out, here we are in 2000, and with gentrification and all the laws that are geared to support and clear out neighborhoods for gentrification, whether they be blight or the new public housing laws that completely evicted multi-generational families from public housing, the gang injunctions that kept people out of the neighborhoods. All of this laid the groundwork for people to lose stable housing or have access to stable housing. Can I get the next slide, please? So let's talk about who's homeless today in Oakland, or just California in general. It is estimated by county counts that there's at least 150,000 people going to sleep in the streets of California every night. It's estimated that 30,000 of them are in the Bay Area, and it's also estimated that 4,000 people are unhoused in Oakland. By the work we do in the streets through the village, we believe that number is closer to 14,000. So then just take that and multiply that to across California. And one thing that everyone can agree on is that the Bay Area is leading the country in a housing crisis and a homeless state of emergency. So who are the folks who are unhoused right now? Very different than the stereotype, right? Most people who are unhoused are Black adults aged 24 to 75. And if we look at the numbers pre-gentrification in the 90s, we see that there's a really similarity. 80% of Oakland's housed residents in the 90s were African-American. And now we shift that around with only 24 being African-American. And then that shift of 70% of the unhoused are African-American. And so we also see that there's a very deep racial bias and racism happening with the housing crisis here in Oakland. Women and children who are fleeing domestic violence make up a significant portion of folks who are unhoused in Oakland, as do LGBTQ youth who've been rejected by their family. We have undocumented folks, refugees from wars, veterans, formerly incarcerated folks, people who are physically sick, people who are mentally sick. This is who is in the streets today. The one thing, for every person who is out there on the streets unhoused, that's how many stories there are of why someone has become unhoused. And so people need to understand that the homeless population is not a monolithic group, that we are very diverse, and each of us have very specific needs. But one thing that we do share is that none of us can afford to live in the new Oakland. Can I get the next slide, please?
Needa, you have 5 minutes left, and
Okay.
please slow down a little bit for the interpreters to catch up.
All right.
Thank
All
you
right.
so much.
So, and I know everyone will be getting these slides, so I'm going to whiz through these really quick for folks to understand the conditions that people are living in. The reality is that what people see out in this, the encampments, the curbside communities, the vehicle dwelling communities, and even the city interventions, the tough sheds, the tiny homes, the RV parks, that is the tip of the iceberg of who's homeless in Oakland. That's the public, what the public sees. A majority of people who are homeless in Oakland are actually invisible. They do not live in the encampments, they live isolated, usually off on their own, hidden away from the public. And so if you can imagine what we publicly see in these massive shanty towns, let's call it what it is. Oakland has shanty towns. That's just a tip. And then can I get the next slide, please? So most people don't have basics to human needs like water, power, sanitation, safety, and no one has access to stability. And what people in the encampments are dealing with is illegal dumping, house predators coming in and exploiting the encampments or the curbside communities, and violence. Like that just is across the board. And that we need several different things from permanent housing. That's the number one thing, is that Oakland claims and the county claims to be a housing first city, and it's not. It's an eviction first city. We'll get more to that in a little bit. Can I get to the next slide? One thing to understand is that this issue of not having access to adequate housing is actually a human rights issue and a civil rights issue. And the city and this country actually refuses to acknowledge housing as a human right. It's one of 3 countries in the entire world of the United Nations body that refuses to actually sign a document that acknowledges that humans have human rights, including housing. And when we're talking about the housing crisis and the lack of accessibility to housing, that we're talking about policies in place that are discriminating people. And they're discriminating people because they're anti-Black, they're anti-poor, they're anti-poverty, and anti-homeless in essence. So what does that all mean? Can I get the next, let's go down the next 2 slides. Skip the next one and go to the, yes. So what does that mean is that these approaches, because they're anti-Black, they're anti-poverty and anti-homeless, are actually approaches that are, they use criminalization of people. Police are used in every aspect of all evictions. And what does that mean is that people who are unhoused are already a criminalized population, not only because people look at unhoused folks as criminals, but because a lot of folks who are on streets are on paperwork. This is also criminalization of unhoused people just increases the trauma, and the criminalization approach actually informs all the policies and practices, all the treatment that's done to unhoused people, and the quality of the interventions. Most of these interventions are mired with corruption or mismanagement here in Oakland. And so I want to talk about the encampment management policy, which is the overriding policy that was passed unanimously by the city council last fall. It is grounded in the false belief that evictions of curbside communities are inevitable. And like I said, these evictions are actually, and cleanups even, they use a huge police presence, which in the defunding moment that we're in is totally counterintuitive, because we're supposed to be defunding the police, but this encampment management policy actually refunds the police. If nobody
Needa,
has been, yes?
You have 2 minutes.
All right, let's go to the very, very, very last slide, so we can just get to the solutions. So looking in and I hope folks do take time to read the rest of the slides in the presentation, but these are some of the key policies that we're pushing as unhoused advocates, as homeless advocates, that we need a moratorium on gentrification. This model does not work for us, period. We need to adopt a new model of development that actually supports and invests the existing populations that are most impacted by displacement. We actually need to mandate percentages and inclusionary clauses. Right now, the city does not force, it's one of the only cities in the US that does not force developers to build deeply affordable housing. It allows them to opt out by paying pennies rather than build housing for people who need it. On a federal level and on a local level, we need to revamp the HUD affordability formula. It doesn't work. Meaning that, 40 years ago, public housing was for people who were making 10 to 12,000 a year. Because that formula is not static, meaning it changes as the housing market changed. Today, public housing is for people who make 80 to 90,000 a year. It doesn't make sense. We also here on a local level need to adopt an accommodation now policy, which is kind of like a housing now policy, or a service now policy, as well as create or accept an idea that encampments don't need to be evicted. They actually need to be supported, and an idea of co-governance needs to happen between curbside community residents and the government. Kind of like what Ms. Margaret said, that the government shouldn't be doing all the work. We should be working together in these situations. We need to upgrade and fix the existing shelter bed system. The City of Oakland's plan is not to build permanent housing. I should point out that none of the city's interventions for homelessness actually include permanent housing. Every single city eviction is a temporary fix that usually leads people right back to the streets. They get exited out of the tough sheds, they get exited out of the cabins, they get exited out of the RV sites, they get exited out of a hotel voucher program and end up right back in the streets. So that needs to change up. The shelter bed system is an open-ended exit plan right back into the streets. We need to start treating vehicle dwellers and vehicle communities as unhoused residents. The city purposefully does not address or treat vehicle dwellers or acknowledge vehicle dwellers as unhoused residents. They acknowledge them as people who are violating vehicle codes, which is a whole nother ballgame. And then we also, most importantly, need to create and enforce a public land policy that serves the greatest needs of the most marginalized when it comes to displacement and lack of housing. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Needa. And I know we asked you to speed up and talk slower. So it was a challenge. And I know I want to apologize to the interpretation, because we are all talking too fast. I'm trying to slow myself down. Maybe language justice will teach us to slow down in general. So thank you again, Needa and Margaretta and Margaret Gordon, for an amazing amount of information. And now we have a good amount of time for questions. And I saw some already in the chat. I want to be, and folks can raise their hand, but I just want to, and Arthur, your hand is still up from last time, I think. But I want to address Esther's, and maybe it's Iodele's question too, and anyone can take this, but it's like looking at specifically the Black population in Oakland seems to suffer worse from all of the statistics listed on every aspect, from environmental justice to housing. And it's linked to a question from yesterday that was, what would a municipal reparations look like? And is that something that we should be talking about, or is it being talked about? You know, I just want to add this one more thing slowly. Something that Needa said is, this country is not going to be able to fix things until it faces the truth that it's all based on stolen land and slavery. So is that what it's going to take for municipal reparations? And are we, anyone kind of, is that on anyone's horizon?
I don't understand the inability to see how the story ends if it's not disrupted in some way that is more substantial than the giving of input. When we look at what Margaretta shared in terms of the yield of the last two cycles of the housing element, one, where's the accountability? How does it state that you need to do one thing and you not only do the opposite, you hella do the opposite? We call them planning sessions. You guys have heard me say for years, then the plan must be for you not to be here. I understand this and have understood this as a form of ethnic cleansing. How the statistics bear it out. Margaretta, you know, I asked you, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, how do we sue them? How do we stop it? It's always been sort of a math formula. If the median population is at this level and 30% is the recommended healthy amount for rent, and the market rate is this, then inevitably Black, Asian, and brown people will be priced out of this city. It's, when do we get to call it what it is? So my question is, are we any closer to suing them than we were 5 years ago, where the approach was we needed case studies? Well, I just heard 14 years of documented statistics. And so it's an all forward press, the putting in of input, the sharing forward of the kind of knowledge that Miss Margaret for it and the understanding that it's a full court press that goes over generations. That's dope. But why is, and maybe that's not the purpose of this community group as it is gathered here to give input to the city's plan. But at what point is that an option? Because that solves a lot of the things that are happening.
Can I, Elena, and address Iodeli's question? Iodeli, good memory. So I'm speaking now as a human being, not as a consultant to the city. Okay, so I don't want to get anyone in deeply rooted in trouble. I'm speaking as Margaretta. And wearing my hat as a former civil rights lawyer. All right. So when to Iodeli's point about what laws are protecting us today, number one, as Needa said, this country, unlike other countries around the world, do not recognize housing as a human right. It sees our country of capitalism and racial capitalism sees housing as a commodity, something to buy on the open market. And so the people who have the most money then get the commodity. So as Needa said, we have to first start with changing our hearts and minds around how we view housing, how we view the right to breathe, to Miss Margaret Gordon's point, right? And once we start shifting how we think and how we feel about these issues, then we start changing, then we change our expectation of government, of people we put into elected office, right? And so a policy framework of housing as a human right would mean we would look at housing the way we look at public education. So that's one thing. And then the law, what is existing law that we can use as a tool? It's this thing called fair housing laws, right? And California was one of the first states in the nation to create our own statewide fair housing laws. So from my perspective as a former civil rights lawyer who used fair housing laws to protect, for example, the low-income immigrants, elderly immigrants in Oakland Chinatown were facing mass eviction from Pacific Renaissance Plaza. We successfully said how the developer was treating those residents, protected racial minorities under the law, was a violation of fair housing. And we won our day in court on that legal issue. Okay, so let's take that and extend it. When city government permits market rate housing projects that they know, because the data that I shared with you all around who can afford what is there, is available. It's public data, it's city data, right? The city, by virtue of that act of permitting these housing projects that exclude people based on race, that violates fair housing laws. So that's the legal theory right there. How do we go from a legal theory to reality? It takes lawyers who are willing to stand up and engage in the years of hard battle litigation. And that was something I had to do when I was a practicing lawyer. I've retired from lawyering, you all. Okay, but we need our young lawyers to engage in this. We need people on the inside of city government to be our allies on this kind of lawsuit. And on other lawsuits I was part of, I had people in government be our internal allies. They wanted us to sue because it gave them the tools they needed to push on the inside. Number three, and this is so important, we need people who are willing to be plaintiffs. Community-based organizations, you all can become a plaintiff. APEN and Causa Justa, they were our plaintiffs on the Pacific Renaissance litigation. Individual residents who've been harmed can be plaintiffs, right? But it's not just a legal solution, because the legal solutions take time. It's an organizing solution. It's getting folks who understand this and who can represent you into the city council, into the mayor's office, right? And so many people here right now, you all are doing that heavy lifting of fighting for all these different housing policies, but we can't keep doing it one policy at a time. It has to be a comprehensive and structural approach. And I'm sorry for going off a bit, but this is.
Thank you, Margaretta. It's powerful. It's a lot we're doing. And Needa, did you have an answer to that question before I take another question?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, everything that Margaretta said, yes. And in addition to that, we need to do direct action. We actually need to shut shit down. We actually need to take over buildings. We need to do stuff totally out. I mean, this is an unusual, this is not cool. What's happening to us is unusual. It is cruel. It is genocide, like people have said. It is completely ethnic cleansing and genocide. And so what happens? We are at war. Yeah. What happens when you're at war? You fight back by any means, right? That's what Malcolm taught us, by any means. And so we have to not just think about changing the policies and doing the lawsuits. Those are important too. We need to be ready to put our bodies on the line before our bodies are gone and removed to another, I just came from Copperopolis, California. I never want to go there again. We're going to push out to places like that. So I think that's the thing too, is that it has to be this really broad based movement that includes all tactics.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's hard fighting racialized capitalism. It's a beast. I think the next person that had their hand up was Marquita.
No, Esther was before me.
Esther. Okay, thanks, Kita. Esther? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Just to go back to the question that I said, or just to bring up and highlight, especially when you bring like legal and law into it, and the fact that, yeah, I know it's certain laws that have not passed and that have passed that basically say you can't do this and that because of race. And just to bring up too, because I heard the question around reparations. So I am a part of a movement that is fighting for reparations on a federal level, because America is the one that did the harm and not state by state. And so I do implore everyone else to follow the work of ADOS, and it's ADOS Advocacy Foundation. They're a C4 now.
Okay.
And so, yeah, when it seems as if we spend more time doing it state by state or city by city, fighting for reparations for Black Americans, than on a federal level. And then in actuality, because all of our harms are rooted from what America has done, and the wealth gap will change once that happens. And I understand that more people know that in order to do that, then that would change Black Americans' trajectory. And I think I kind of lost, because it was so much powerful stuff that had been said since I raised my hand, but I did want to highlight the reparation fight, because it's so important. And no, and COBRA is a fraud. And I guess anybody can get my information so we can talk about it, because it's really about either publicity or actually moving us all up as a people. And so anybody that follows those other movements and not ADOS, I really would like to talk about that. But anyway, to the city, I really like really appreciate this group of people and these folks and just all this work. And so I'm like, because I lost my train of thought on why I originally raised my hand, I'll just pass it. All right, check.
Thank you, Esther. Can you put that link to the federal group you're working with in the, or some info in the chat? That would be great. And I know there you're saying it's not state by state for reparations, which is true, but I know there is a statewide group working, and it seems like common sense says use the reparations money to house the unhoused, because they're mostly Black folks out there. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. Marquita.
Yeah, no, sorry. So I was saying that there are many workings for reparations now, because when reparations became a code word, right, and everybody started using it, and that's what happens if we don't know that. That's what happens. People catch on, just like right now, language justice is being used and it's a catchy word. And I remember when sustainability and all that became code words, and then we use it, and it's still like when I heard someone say, can we just speak the truth? Yep, like equity. Can we just speak the truth for really what it is? And that's why I always highlight Black Americans, because even when we say Black, like that's a flat Black. And that includes like even people that migrated here and not that was born from slavery, that here are in America, that is tethered to the bottom, that will only raise up and change when reparations is paid from the federal government to them. So yes, I'll put all that information down, and I'll put mine so we can just continue to talk about it too.
Okay, thank you. Keita.
What's up with it, everybody? Thank you, Deeply Rooted, Needa Bee, Margaretta, and Ms. Margaret for your presentations earlier. Much appreciated. Yeah, so first of all, just kudos, and I second direct action, and yes, suing the city and such like that. No, forward in terms of us holding the city accountable. But I'm gonna turn it to like kind of community on community for a second. And you can call it playing devil's advocate or not or whatever. But first of all, I'm 100% in support and have compassion for the unhoused, what's going on, everything that Needa Bee said or whatnot, without going into it. But for my own personal experiences, just as, even though I have full compassion and I do not believe the narrative that everybody out here are homeless criminals and this and that, I don't believe that very far left narrative. Yet at the same time, some folks who have the very far right narrative that kind of like what you were saying, but I know where you're coming from, so not you, but some folks will just completely make it seem like, again, no, everyone out here is bad on their luck, and they try to make great choices, but necessarily just on a bad luck in the system or whatnot. And again, from my direct personal experience, it's been in the middle or whatnot. Yes, you have some people, it's in the middle without going into it in my personal experience or whatnot. And from homeless folks across the board or whatnot. And again, sorry, I'm getting choked up because again, it's hard to talk in spaces of community and progressive spaces, kind of speaking, not in opposition, because I'm not opposing. I'm just trying to bring up the fact that yes, I am compassionate and feel and even work for or that service to homeless for 5 years or whatnot. Yet it's just, I don't hear enough support for like myself, even though I'm housed, so what? Like, I gotta just take the burden of something. And I'm not talking about visual blight. Like I can deal with some stuff, but again, I walk over shit, literally. I have to trace out my route like a bike route to get to certain places for just my own mental health or whatnot. I try to talk to folks my own kind of way, because again, I got compassion. I got family members that lived around the corner in the tennis court. Like I got everything in my family. So again, I'm not far from it or whatnot. So I definitely feel for it. Yet when I have personal experiences interacting, trying to extend and have that compassion or help folks and resources outside of EOC or anybody else, just because of who I am, trying to help people, and I get spat on or whatnot, and I get more of those experiences than, oh, they're just bad on their luck or whatnot. Because for me, the invisible folks that's unhoused to me is like when I was unhoused, the couch surfers, the students or whatnot. I don't hear a lot talked about, them or whatnot. Like I was struggling as a student, which is why I got in this work in the first place, because I didn't see enough resources for anybody who wasn't pregnant, under the age of 21, foster care or something like that or whatnot. But I just want to put that out there. Like, you feel me? I definitely feel for it, put in work for it, and still will moving forward. Yet again, on community side, I don't hear enough about self-accountability. And again, the system is fucked up. We know that. But to some extent, where is the self-accountability of personal choices? I've had people tell me straight up, I just don't want to do this. I just don't want to do that. And that's your right. Because again, the system is fucked up. But at the same time, you just can't disregard everybody else's living to some extent. Like, how do we better cohabitate is what I'm trying to figure out, because I do have compassion, but I get stressed and it gets exhausting. Like, so now I'm caring about people more than myself. And that's not healthy. And I found myself doing that. And that's why, and then so when I get now when I'm trying to tell y'all, it seems like I'm like, hella riled up, but it's just because I don't get to tell nobody or whatnot, except like mama or something. But it's like, yeah, I care, but damn, again, it's just like, this stuff is stressful for the housed person or the person trying to help just as much. And it's like, where do we meet each other? I done been called a faggot, nigger, bitch, queer, by white fucking homeless people or whatnot on my block that I ain't never seen from here. But, and I came up trying to get EOC resources. Let me get you a porta potty. Let me do you this. I don't need your help. Like, I don't even want to go into it, but that's what I'm saying. What about our trauma? What about the triggers that I have from dealing with folks that just, or the violent ones, or the ones that just don't really give a mess or whatnot? Like, I'll just stop there. But just like, as a community, how do we start talking about that? You feel me? And so that we can, so I don't want to be exhausted. I don't want to feel like I don't want to just do that work at all, because that's not how I feel. It's just, I don't want to do it in certain ways other folks do it. Because again, I still hold down people around here. I'm cool with the RV dude on my block. Like, it's not what you do, it's how you do. And so how can we better cohabitate, housed or unhoused? Like, we all have a certain responsibility, and I don't hear enough of those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you,
Keita. And I'm glad that this was a good space for you to share that. I'm glad you felt that way and did share. And I think Needa does want to respond.
Yeah, I hella appreciate you, Keita, for that. And I agree with you. I think this work is really difficult to do because, unfortunately, like when you talk about the visible unhoused folks in the shanty towns, in the sprawling, tent cities, whatnot, unfortunately, we're also dealing with folks who have given up a lot of times. And we're also dealing with folks who are being exploited and coerced and controlled by organized crime that is in cahoots with the police and with the city. Like, part of dealing with this homeless issue and the sprawling homelessness is also dealing with the corruption happening in the city. And that's why I call it a homeless industrial complex. And I think, one thing that we've learned the hard way is that, and it's unfortunate, it's really hard to like deal with, but there's only so much you can do for folks who have given up on themselves. Like, we actually have to focus on folks who haven't, which a lot of times is the invisible unhoused folks. So it's like, how do you find the unhoused folks who are trying to hide so they don't get caught, so their kids don't get taken away, so their RV doesn't get stolen? And that's, that requires us to be out in the streets and working with people. But I hear everything you say, and I feel it is a two-way thing. I think it's about having these conversations about how do we be good neighbors to each other. And there is, that's another thing with the encampments, is that there is natural leadership in each of those tent cities. And what we've seen happening with the city interventions is the city's removing those folks and putting them in temporary interventions. So now so you see crime and chaos happening, that's because the people who were really taking care of those encampments got moved into a hotel, got moved into a tough shed. And that made the encampment that much harder and that much worse. But I think everything Keita said is right on. I think it's real. Like, this is really complicated and there's so many layers. And I think part of it too is that goes back to the folks who don't give a fuck anymore and the folks who just don't want the services or whatnot. We still need to have that conversation, because like you said, folks still have that right to decide how they want to exist. And that needs to be addressed, and we have to have a real conversation, but folks don't want to have that conversation. About what's lacking and then what's what's possible. So I appreciate you bringing all that stuff up, Keita.
I appreciate you, and I want to hit you offline too, because I do want to get, yeah, I want to get more informed and involved stuff, because I don't want to just be angry and exhausted. So maybe we can help create these these talks and places.
Yeah, thanks. And there's so many folks that need to be part of all of these conversations. You know, there's so many folks that I talked to at Acoma Market that had been living in Oakland, for instance, for generations and now are moved out, you know, and want to come back, you know, so there's so many different voices. And I think it's going to be all of us kind of having solidarity with each other and moving it as much forward as possible. James Van, you are on, Mr. Van.
Thank you very much. This is an amazing conversation. Makita, I also want to thank you for bringing in the elements of community to this conversation. And I also appreciate very much all the presenters and the depth of research and wisdom that's shown in the presentations and in the material that's being presented. We need to make sure that this material becomes part of the general plan, not just a conversation among ourselves, but this is important information, and I want to make sure it becomes part of the general plan when they get that done. One of the other things I think we need is to make sure that Oakland adopts the policy that housing is a human right. If we can get our city to adopt that as policy, then a lot of things flow from that. For instance, we talk about it's criminal to have the city proposing that public land should be made available for market rate housing. Margarita was absolutely correct. The private developers do not need the city's assistance to develop. They're doing fine on their own, and they're becoming very lucrative in the process. The East 12th Street, the Lake Merritt Boulevard, 12th Street, East 12th Street remained a parcel. The RFP for that parcel was put out in 2015 for market rate housing, for a high-rise market rate housing. That was criminal. Thank goodness, due to the assistance of council member, the president of the council, that RFP has now been retracted after some 7 years of failed attempts to try to put a high rise on that site. But all public land, I agree, all public land at this point, given the needs we have, need to be designated for affordable housing for people who will not be served by the private market. And the city has to recognize that. But once we have the city's adoption and as a public policy that housing is a human right, then a lot of things flow from that. We can begin to address demand, that we address the homeless situation, public lands policy being to serve that need as well, and homelessness being eliminated. America is supposedly the richest country in the world. Cuba is one of the poorest countries in this world. There is no homelessness in Cuba, but there's homelessness all over the United States. This is criminal. There are so many things that are criminal about the way we carry on business here, and let's get the city to adopt housing as a human right, and so that we can begin to address some of these inequities. Thank you.
Thank you. Margaretta, I wanted you to speak on a minute because it came up yesterday as a chat question about market rate housing. And someone asked, is there a way to put a moratorium on market rate housing being built since the city has overextended its what it's set out to do?
It's going to be legally complicated, but I would say yes, because number one, Oakland is a charter city, which means as a charter city in California, we have more power than other cities. So That's a distinction between Oakland and other cities in California. Number two, cities have the ultimate responsibility to protect the public health and safety of its residents. There's a direct connection between housing and public health and safety. On that basis, I believe the city, if it wanted to, it's going to take some effort. The city attorney's office needs to get involved to lay out the legal foundation for this. But I think Oakland can do that. Also, just want to note that, and this is something that each and every city council member can do right now, which is use the power of their political voice and authority, right? So there's a city council member in the Bronx. He does not allow any housing projects to move forward in his district if they're building a single housing unit that his constituency cannot afford. Okay, in the mission of San Francisco, the community organized too late, but they organized a mission, kind of like a planning council, an informal planning council. The San Francisco Planning Department does not approve any development projects that this mission community resident council does not approve. Right? So we have everything we need today to prevent market rate housing projects from coming in. We have everything we need today to prevent the city from selling off public land to market rate housing, which it has been doing for the last 8 years. And I use the number 8 very intentionally, right? And it's a matter of this community activation. Liz Suck is right. It's all about community power.
Thanks, Margaret. Margaret, did you have a response? Were you going to respond to James Van's?
I know I had another comment I wanted to add, actual statement. There's other lands that are underutilized throughout our city, and especially and also add who's not here. The churches have a lot of disposable land, unusable land, starting from the hill area all the way down. Whereas that we still have segregation based on who gets to live where. We don't still, why there are not affordable units of income-based housing in the hill area? The city does not, where's those developers at? Providing the use of that land above 580 or above 13. That's a lot of, some of that land belongs to the city. Why is they not building housing up there that is affordable or low income based? Why is it we don't have partnerships starting with the churches in those areas to build on some of that land, their land, for nothing else, just for seniors. All right, for seniors. And so I think part of this toolkit that we're looking at, all the things that Margaretta just talked about, what's happening in the Bronx and also in the Mission, should be a part of this toolkit, and that we need to be messaging a lot of this stuff to our communities right now while we in this process of looking at the general plan, and call out the discrimination, the racism, and that how city staff participates in it. Because a lot of stuff starts with the city staff, and also including the city attorney's office, they participate in some of this. All right, they participate in some of this. So we got to make have our messaging much more defined per issue to be able to get this toolkit in place for our action plan.
Thank you. And all this data that's being presented is going to be what we need to do that. I want to.
And I have tons of data. I have tons of data about environmental justice, public health for the last. That's why I'm suing. That's why, as of right this minute, West Oakland Environmental Indicators is suing the Port of Oakland and Eagle Rock, a company that they want to bring in to add more pollution to West Oakland.
That's good. So through this Deeply Rooted, we hope to have everyone stay connected to all of these things. Liz.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been such an amazing conversation, and just to know it's so hopeful for Oakland that there are folks who are really fighting for the soul of this city. And although the work, I'm humbled to be in the presence of such great voices. We went through just the redistricting process very recently in Oakland, and have been looking at a lot of the data, both census and, the American survey data, community survey data that the Census Department does, as well as all of much of the data that was shared here as well, and looking at campaign donors and voting trends in Oakland as well. One of the big trends that we have seen is that actually in the same places where we are seeing an increased displacement of Black Americans in Deep East Oakland, and have seen it happen in West Oakland, we have seen an increase of white population moving into those neighborhoods. We have also seen an increase of Latina community and an increase of API communities as well. And so I think, and I know that this is sort of more, it's very nuanced. So I really like to look at the data that Ms. Margaret was sharing in terms of like the block by block, because it really is block by block. Looking at which communities are also being turned over, and how we are now shifting some of the landscape, that there are a lot of white folks moving in. There is a lot of that. I don't want to discount that, but I also want to consider what the impact of other communities of color moving into these neighborhoods looks like, and also kind of spanning out a little farther. I appreciate the framing that Needa Bee gave around, that this is the homelessness and pushing communities out is really the foundation of this country and this land, not this land, but this country on this land. And in many places around the world, and the impact of US intervention and occupation of lands in other places, and similarly the displacement happening here in Oakland and the communities that follow that. So I think that there's a nuanced conversation to be had in the communities of color, particularly amongst poorer communities. And the messaging and the way that we approach it within, the Latina and the API communities, particularly immigrant and monolingual communities, non-English speaking communities, like what that looks like for us and what that means for affordable housing. And I think that there is definitely a need to prioritize the continual targeting of Black folks who have been in Oakland towards around the issues around affordable housing and housing itself, and what ways we address homelessness in Oakland. But I do think that there is a nuanced piece around environmental justice and around housing that needs to look at the impact that immigrant communities and other communities